Hi everyone. I'd like to start off by introducing you to someone special who I'm sure half of you have guessed who it is already. But this is my dog, Imre. The first picture was taken when he was 7 weeks old at a shelter, and I told my boyfriend Murray that I'd rather sleep at the shelter than leave without him. And that's him now at about 1.5 years old, and he's just the cutest thing ever. But he didn't have the happiest story and the happiest start to life like many other dogs. He was a stray, 6 weeks old, wandering in the streets by himself, and luckily picked up by the awesome people who rescued him. So, like him, in 2011 there were 230,000 stray dogs in Cape Town alone. And I wasn't able to find a more recent stat, but I think that's pretty bad, as is. And just to put that into perspective for you guys, how many of you have attended Rocking the Daisies? Okay, so you know there's a crazy amount of people at Rocking the Daisies every year, and take that amount of people that you see and times it by 11.5, and you'll get the amount of stray dogs that are walking around in Cape Town at that time. So it was a lot of homeless dogs. So why is this? A lot of people believe that it's breeders that are the issue, and while they aren't exactly helping the problem, they definitely are not the primary source of these dogs being homeless. They're definitely not the only reason that dogs are being left in shelters their whole lives. So then it's the fact that we live in a third world country. We have a lot of rural developments and a lot of dogs in these rural developments. Yeah, there is a problem there, but these people can't afford to get their dogs neutered and spayed, and you can't exactly say, oh, you're not allowed to own a dog because you live in a rural development. That's just cruel. So while these two problems do contribute to this massive overpopulation issue, I am actually here to speak about problems that we can fix quite easily instead of these long-lasting problems. So one of them is a lack of education. When I was doing research, I found the saddest stories of, oh, this dog ended up in a shelter because this woman bought the dog for her son and he didn't look after her, so a year later she's in the shelter back at the beginning. Or too expensive, they're running my life, they're ruining my shoes, they're doing all these things, and I can't afford the dogs anymore, so I'm bringing them back to the shelter. And while that's a huge problem, I just want to tackle, most importantly, the misconceptions that are often circled around animals that come from shelters, and hopefully change the minds today about shelter animals and hopefully get some adoptions going. So the first misconception is that dogs from shelters or strays are very sickly. So while it's quite a believable thing for people to believe, because when you go to shelters, they're not always the cleanliest places, because there are very few people who are willing to give up their lives and their time to, you know, look after these dogs. There's limited hands for a great amount of these animals. And while it's easy to believe, it's actually untrue. Normally when a dog arrives at a shelter, there's a vet that actually does a full physical examination on them. And if there are any problems, the dog is then fixed or made better. And then normally when they are actually sent to a home, before they're sent home, a lot of the time they have another physical examination done just to make sure that they are fine to be sent home. Then another misconception is that dogs from shelters have behavioural issues. And let me tell you something, all dogs have behavioural issues. They're like children running around, they destroy things, they are havoc, but they're great, but they're naughty. That's what I'm trying to get across. And I'm sure the people who took these pictures of their dogs will agree that dogs are quite a handful. But it's not just shelter dogs that have these problems. It's any dog, most animals are going to do things and break your heart a lot of the times when they chew your favorite pair of shoes up, but it happens. And there is a stat that I wrote down. The SPCA actually did a survey, and they were asking people why they were bringing their dogs back. And 28% of people said that they were bringing their animals back due to family issues, so they were moving overseas, they couldn't take their dog. They were moving to old age home, and they couldn't take their dog with. So 28% of the dogs in shelters did absolutely nothing wrong. They just ended up there because people couldn't look after them anymore. And 18% of people say they couldn't afford them anymore, so they ended up there because of that. And now a lot of people don't want to adopt them because they think, oh, well, these dogs ended up there because they're very naughty, and I don't want a dog like that in my house, which is often extremely incorrect. The third misconception that I'd like to tackle is that you can't get a purebred dog from a shelter. Through a lot of research, I found that a lot of people want purebred dogs, and absolutely nothing wrong with that. But just something that I'd like to tackle with this, and to prove that there are a lot of purebred dogs that go unwanted, is something called the designer dog trend. So for those of you who don't know what the designer dog trend is, it's basically a trend that comes about with a certain dog at a certain time. So I don't know how many of you would remember, like 15 years back, when Paris Hilton was popular and her chihuahuas were all over the internet, and everyone was like, I want a chihuahua. I want to be like Paris Hilton. And so the breeders began. And there was this supply, and there was this oversupply of dogs, and a dwindling demand eventually, and so these dogs all ended up in shelters. Recently, it happened with pugs. It was a huge pug craze. In the moment, it's French bulldogs and Boston Terriers that are quite popular. And so there's these huge supplies of these dogs, and they actually end up going in shelters because half of them can't find homes after this breeding frenzy. And they actually are rescue centres that set out to help purebred dogs specifically. Pug Rescue South Africa, Husky Rescue South Africa, and Pit Pals are just some names put forward. If you're looking for any of those dogs, you can go there. But any shelters do end up with unwanted purebred dogs, just like they do with your standard mutt like Emre. Okay, and the last misconception that I'd like to tackle is you can't get a puppy from a shelter. So obviously, this is incorrect. I am the proof of that. I got Emre at 7 weeks old. And this is a picture from the same shelter that he was at. And just referring back to the overpopulation issue that I was speaking about earlier, the fact that there's a lot of breeding in townships due to a lack of neutering and spaying. A lot of puppies end up in shelters because people cannot look after them. They can't afford to. They're just running around in the streets going crazy. And so they end up in shelters looking for homes. And they might not be, I think they are, but they might not be the prettiest looking dogs in the world, but they're still there and they're still deserving of a home. So that just brings me to a final few slides. The change starts with us. So as human beings, it's quite normal for us to kind of, oh, well, it's not my problem. I didn't do anything wrong. I didn't breed a dog. Like, what am I supposed to do? We're always pointing fingers and passing blame instead of actually doing something. Well, not always, but it is often a characteristic that we share. So, like I'm doing today, I'm passing on some information and some facts, and hopefully I can change one mind in here today, and that means my job is done. But just, the change starts with us. Speak to people. If someone says, oh, I want to get a dog, say to them, well, have you looked at a shelter? They actually shelter dogs there that might need. Instead of paying 15 grand for a dog, you can pay 800 rand, and they'll have all their vaccinations done. Then, if you can't adopt a dog, or you don't want to, there's still many things that you can do to help. You can, these are just some shelters in and around Cape Town that do tremendously great work, and you can donate money, and it doesn't have to be money. It can be old blankets, old beds, food, anything that you can find that's lying around. It was mentioned earlier, one man's trash is another man's treasure. So an old blanket that could be lying in your cupboard that means nothing to you could actually be something that'll keep a dog warm at night, or a cat, or whatever it may be. And then, just a finishing thought. As humans, we really are moving towards a waste-free life. We don't want to use single-use plastic. We don't want to use straws. It's like looked down upon to, waste in general. So why is it that we don't look at dogs' lives that way? Why don't we look at animals' lives this way? Why do we carry on breeding and carry on buying and supporting people who are contributing to the problem? Why do we waste lives? We can reduce, reuse, and recycle just with lives as well. So let's change the world and speak for those who can't speak for themselves. Thank you.